Pouring concrete is something we do on our channel because it's something I do in my life, and it's something that Nathan's been doing in Mesa. And so, yeah, it shows up on the channel quite a bit, and there are some questions that show up really consistently every time we put up a video about pouring concrete. And they're good questions. They're legitimate questions that deserve real answers. And so we're going to hit 2 or 3 of these, and hopefully that it will answer some of these questions for you, and hopefully it'll provoke some more concrete questions. The first one that comes up more often than any of them is about slump. Slump is the viscosity or the runniness, the liquidity of the batch. It is increased by adding water to the batch. Here is the problem with increasing the slump in your concrete. As you increase the amount of water relative to the amount of cement, and cement, Portland cement, is the stuff that makes concrete get hard, hydraulic cement, Portland cement. We'll do a video sometime on Roman cement and Portland cement and the evolution, the development of concrete through the understanding and discovery of cement. But as you increase the water to cement ratio, you decrease the ultimate strength of your concrete. Water in concrete makes it weaker over time. So you try not to do that. The problem is it takes a certain amount of water in the batch to make it flowable, plastic enough to be able to get it in place and get it looking good. So there's this continual tension between how loose, how high the slump, and how strong as a function of how low the slump. There have been 2 of our concrete videos where the concrete was too wet. It was wetter than I would have picked. I'm thinking of the video Concrete Finishing Done Right, where Dustin and his crew did a beautiful job on a really nice patio. I ordered that batch, I think, at about a 5-inch slump, which is slightly on the high side. I mean, 4 is better. You'll be on government jobs sometimes where they will spec a 2 or a 3-inch slump. And brother, that's miserable. But you'll have an inspector there enforcing that. And if it's not a 2 or a 3-inch slump, you send the load back because you're not putting it on this job. So anyhow, the truck showed up on that nice little patio job and dumped into the hopper, and Dustin turned to me and he said, he knew we were filming, I had the camera rolling, and he said, they're gonna zipper kick us over this slump. And he was right. I went ahead and poured it for 2 reasons. Number 1, it was a pumpable mix, which means it routinely breaks at 4,000 psi and higher. So even a slightly high slump, in this case maybe a 6, was still going to yield strong concrete. And 3.5 years later, that patio is still beautiful. It's beautiful. Here's another thing about slump and concrete that I didn't know until I started watching videos that were being shown at high speed of concrete being poured. And that is that even a good slump, even a 4-inch slump being filmed at 2 or 4 times life speed looks like high slump because it moves quickly. The pile falls down visually in a moment while you're watching in exactly the same way a load of 8 or 9 or 10-inch slump concrete would fall down as soon as it hits the ground. So keep that in mind when you're watching concrete being poured at a sped up video rate. It's a deceptive perspective on slump. Now, I don't mean to excuse this entirely because that Arizona pour, I think that was probably about a 5, maybe one of those loads was a 6. But man, it was 3/4 inch high strength. It was good mix. And it was 8 inches thick. Which brings me to the next question. Rebar placement, especially on that Arizona driveway approach. We pointed out in the video that the rebar section was minimal, except over the top of that storm drain. Did you notice a storm drain that showed up in the dirt work video of that job? Well, from the time Nate started work on that site, he knew that there was a big storm drain. I think that's probably a 4-foot diameter pipe, barely below the surface. I mean, barely, to where he discovered it and thought, wow, can I drive my trucks in and over this? And he put the track out, some dirt over the top, and he worried about it through the course of construction because who wants to fall into a 4-foot storm drain? And so the entire reason that his approach is concrete, 8 inches of concrete instead of 3 inches of asphalt, was to shield, to protect that storm drain, which is too close to the surface. So if you look at that video again, and I hope you do, you'll see that there were transverse bars across the top of that pipe, and the whole 8-inch approach is providing a real structural buffer to that pipe. And why change the thickness when you get away from that? There's no reason. I mean, it was not good business to do anything except put 8 inches over the top of that pipe and thus through the whole approach. Another frequently read comment or question about that Arizona pour was especially using the jitterbug, the tamp, to push down the rocks. We talked about that to make it more workable and bring the cream to the top. The guys from the northern latitudes are saying, hey man, that wouldn't fly up here because you push the rocks down, you bring the cream up in an area with intense freeze-thaw cycles. If you've got an area where you're getting snow and ice on your driveway for most of the winter, and it thaws and it freezes and it thaws and it freezes, that means the water is penetrating your driveway, your sidewalk, freeway bridges. The water penetrates and then it freezes and that water expands and it will pop the top right off of that concrete if you don't have rocks in there tying it all together. So if in tamping or jitterbugging you bring, I don't know, 1/4 of an inch of cream to the top, in Canada, in Montana, you're going to have a terribly spalled and rough and almost unusable concrete surface in a short period of time. But in Arizona, boys, freeze-thaw is not an issue. You slope that stuff so when the monsoons come, the water sheets off of there, gets into the storm drain, and you don't spend any time laying awake at night worrying about, should I have put entrained air into that mix and should I have tamped it? Is the top going to spall off tonight when it gets down to 42 degrees? The answer is no. Let me back up and talk about slump and water to cement ratios and concrete strength one more time. There are admixtures called plasticizers, super plasticizers, and I have no idea what the chemistry is, but you can pour 5 gallons of that stuff into a batch, and that concrete thinks that it just got hit with, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 gallons of water. And when it comes out of the chute, it is a sea level slump, high slump, but since it did not have water added, it will not reduce the ultimate strength. Now you may get segregation of the aggregate if you're not careful. I mean, it can get so loose that the rocks fall to the bottom and the cream stays on the top, and that's no good. But there are ways to increase slump without decreasing strength. And while you've not seen it on the channel yet, I'm sure you will, and I'll point it out. But it's magic, the things that chemistry has brought to bear on concrete that the Romans could not imagine no matter how they were making their cement. Concrete, perhaps more than any other aspect of construction, although that's clearly a contestable assertion, has an incredibly and perhaps the widest range of variables and allowable tolerances. There are concrete footings that are poured underwater where the finish is absolutely not an issue. There are concrete floors that are poured in military installations or in high volume warehouses where the F factors, the flatness factors that are specified on the drawings by the engineer, by the architect, are so tight, and the floor has to be so virtually perfectly flat for safety or for some other aspect of function that it takes essentially robotic equipment to make it perfect. And so between these two extremes, every job has its own allowable tolerance on finish in terms of smoothness, in terms of texture, in terms of flatness. And flatness is perhaps the easiest one to identify in a process, as whether or not the process that you're watching happens is going to yield a piece of concrete that is as flat as perhaps you, while you're watching, thinks it ought to be. Think of the footings you may have watched us pour in the spec house. Only had to be flat enough and smooth enough to put the wall forms on. Think of that little sand finish patio that you saw us pour in front of that nice house. That needed to be flat enough that it really felt good under a bare foot and that the water sheeted out of there perfectly. Perfectly. No bird baths allowable any place. And then think of the driveway. It had to be flat enough that the slope that the site dictated would get all the water off in a monsoon. The water needs to sheet off of there. Doesn't really matter if there's an occasional bird bath. It doesn't have to feel good under a bare foot because it's only going to be used under a rubber tire. And so it has, on that one, if it looks good, it is good. If the water gets off of there, that's perfect. And so between these extremes, there's a whole continuum of what is acceptable and how it's done. every area of the world, but I'll just speak to what I know about. Every area of the country that I've worked in has its own twist on process. There are people who will only use an aluminum screed or rod. There are people who use round stakes or square stakes or top hooks, wire hooks, screwed on hooks. There are people who use power trowels and blue gliders, which are a big, wide Fresno. There's as many processes as there are concrete finishers. And any concrete finisher worth his salt can hit whatever allowable tolerance is dictated by the plans, by the engineer, by the owner. And when you have that guy on the job, you're going to get what you need. And he's going to have his own way of making it happen. And that's the magic of YouTube, isn't it? You can see how other people do it, and you can see what it is they produce. So keep these questions coming. They're important. It's one of the reasons that this whole YouTube thing is worthwhile, is for the interaction and the education. So if you've got a question, you throw it out there and you don't see an answer right away, just scroll down through the other questions and answers, because somebody's already asked it, and probably some of the really smart people that hang out around here are going to have an answer that is going to solve your problem. Thanks for watching.